Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, helping you ace your exams at school and university through the psychology of high performance and the science of studying smarter, not harder. It's my pleasure to introduce your host, the Cambridge-trained memory psychologist and exam success coach, William Wadsworth.
Hello and welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast. This month on the show, we're doing a mini-series covering the academic skills of note-making, research and writing. We kicked things off last week with a look at the science of note-making with Professor John Dunlosky. Today, we're following that up with a really interesting look at the art of note-making with Jorge Arango, author of Duly Noted, Extend Your Mind Through Connected Notes. One of the ideas in the book that particularly resonated with me is the idea that notes are not just a tool for information capture, but they can be a really useful tool for actually thinking things through, whether that's brainstorming, problem solving, planning, drawing insights, building connections. And as a result of this, note making isn't just a skill we need if you happen to be sitting in lectures and you need to take ideas down because you're not given a handout. Note making really becomes a useful tool we can apply to so many different skills in our studies and more generally in life. To draw a connection of my own for you, there's a strong thematic link in some of the things we'll touch on today, back to an episode we did earlier this year on cognitive load theory. That was episode 155 with Ollie Lovell, in which we covered the idea that our capacity to hold multiple ideas in mind simultaneously is limited. That is to say, if we try and kind of hold on to too many ideas in our mind all at once, we become cognitively overloaded, or as we more commonly say, we become confused. And note-making can help us with this by acting as what the scientists would call an offload strategy, letting you effectively extend your brain's thinking capacity by offloading some of those ideas from having to simply just hold them in your mind and letting you write them down on paper. So George is a pretty extensive user of notes in his own life, and today's conversation will be a window into a world of what for many of you I think will be quite a next level way of thinking about notes and how to build a whole system around taking and connecting your notes. So really interesting conversation, lots of food for thought. Let's meet George and dive right in.
All right, so my name is Jorge Arango. I'm an information architect, author, and educator. I usually introduce myself with those three epithets. Those three things, as you will see, are related. I've written a book about note-taking, and I suspect that's going to be the bulk of our conversation today. And by way of introduction, I'll say that my background originally is in architecture, as in the design of buildings. But I've been focused on designing digital experiences, software, basically, websites, apps, digital products for the last 30 years. And what's happened to me is that in the course of doing that work, you have to learn a lot, right? Technology is constantly changing. There's also meetings that happen with other folks, engineers, stakeholders, research participants. And note-taking has always been an important part of my work. And what happened to me is that over time, I realized that many of the practices that I was implementing to make software easier to use, information easier to find and understand, were also applicable to my own learning, my own notes. So I've written this book, which essentially tries to, it aims to share with folks practices, mental models, techniques that will help them think more effectively using notes, and that are gleaned from this world of information architecture that is structuring information to make it easier to find and understand.
You obviously rate note-making as a very important skill for all sorts of domains of life. I wonder if you just talk briefly to your kind of enthusiasm for notes and, why should we all be taking it so seriously as well?
Yeah, for me, well, like I said, I've been taking notes for a long time, starting when I was a wee lad in school, right? I think that's how many of us started taking notes. We would attend to classes and had to write down what the teacher was saying. And I would say that that's how I've taken notes most of my life, by writing down what I've heard or what I've read, primarily with the objective of somehow remembering it later, right? So if you're going to have an exam afterwards, the notes help you recall what was said. I think that that's the primary way that I came to notes, and I suspect it's the primary way that a lot of people come to notes. For me, though, there was this breakthrough that happened through my work. I was exposed to a set of ideas that come from the field of cognitive science. I have colleagues who have written very compellingly about this stuff. In particular, there's what is called embodied cognition. Mm-hmm. The idea that thinking is not something that happens exclusively in this meat computer that we have above our shoulders, right? And I think that a lot of us think of the brain as some kind of computer, right? Like some kind of biological computer. I used to think that that's where thinking happened, and then I would just write down what I was thinking. But after reading up and learning about all this stuff from cognitive science research, I've come to a different model, which is that we think with, the brain is an important part of how we think, but we also think with things in the world. I think that this is obvious to you if you've ever tried to read, for example, in a very noisy environment. There are some people, myself included, for whom having distractions makes it difficult to focus on whatever I'm trying to learn. And conversely, you can set up environments to aid in your thinking. And notes are a cognitive augmentation. They're an extended part of our minds. They serve, if we're trying to remember something, they serve kind of as a prosthetic memory, right? Where we externalize ideas so that we can recall them later. But that's not the only use case for notes. If you think about, for example, planning out a presentation or an essay that you're writing, a very common way to do that is to start outlining on a piece of paper, right? Or using a computer. In that case, the computer or the paper are serving as this kind of buffer that augments your creative capacity. By seeing the words on the page or on the screen, you think about them differently. It sparks different ideas. You can explore relationships that you might not have if you were just thinking about them in the abstract. So for me, notes are a very accessible cognitive augmentation. And if you buy into that idea, you'll see why I'm so excited about them, because we're all, well, I'll speak for myself. I was born with limited capacities in my wetware, my brain computer. But if you tell me that there are ways for me to extend those abilities using things in the world, then I get excited, right? Because that's something that I can do something about. I can learn how to think more effectively. And that's the role that notes play for me more broadly.
And this idea really spoke to me as well. There's a quote I made a note of from your book. It's a part where you talk about you think by writing things down. Thinking isn't just happening in your brain and then captured on paper. Instead, you're thinking with and on paper. These scribbles set up a feedback loop. You draw an arrangement that doesn't look quite right, but sparks ideas for improvement. So you draw another and another and another. Like this idea that you think by writing things down, that really resonated with me. And one of the things I thought about, you're kind of mentioning some of the cog-psych principles you've been thinking about. One thing that put me in mind of was the idea of cognitive load theory, this idea that our working memory has a limited capacity. We can only kind of think and process like so much at once. But the ability to write things down allows us to kind of get ideas out of our head, out of our working memory, so we don't need to be thinking about them in that instant. We sometimes call that an offload strategy. So as you're writing things down, as you're thinking, you're kind of offloading those elements from having to be remembered, and that frees up your brain to have new ideas, draw relationships between ideas you've already had, zoom out, think about how the structure of things fits together, have new insights, all those good things. And certainly, I talked about this on the podcast a couple of times this year, but like I feel like I have quite limited working memory capacity, but have yet managed to operate at quite a high level, both academically and sort of subsequently. And one of the things that has led to is like a real personal hunger and interest in kind of strategies that help me do more with, perhaps as you were saying, like somewhat slightly more limited brain capacity in certain ways. So, anytime I've had to be creative or like figure things out, like the first thing I've done is reach for pen and paper and start, writing down my thoughts as they exist today, mapping out a tree diagram, starting to figure out ideas. Yeah. So this idea, I really spoke to me, some of your ideas around this.
Yeah. And an influential author in my life in this capacity is David Allen. He wrote this book, Getting Things Done, right, which I think a lot of folks are familiar with. And he makes the argument that you're mentioning there, the idea that if you externalize your thinking, you're freeing up your mental processes to focus on other things, right? So he talks about this very kind of poetic phrase. He says that he aims for mind like water, right? The idea that it's still somehow. And he does it by, in his case, by making lists of things that are pending, commitments, things that he's agreed to do or what have you. That's where I encountered for the first time this idea, and it's definitely related to what we're talking about here, which is kind of just note taking more broadly, right? Like more generally. The same principle that applies to commitments also applies to ideas that you may want to circle back to. And just knowing that there's a place in the world where you have captured that. Well, again, I'll speak about myself. I find it very comforting. It helps kind of quiet the mind, right? Like I went on a walk this morning and I was having all of these ideas about things that I'm planning and projects that I'm working on. And if I don't write those down, the ideas are going to keep, they're going to keep coming up in my mind, right? But if I do write them down and I know where I've written them down, then I can kind of move on, mentally. I can move on and I can open up space for other things, right? So again, to me, the idea of some kind of buffer, right? I think it's important. And it's something that we can do relatively easily, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, the David Allen quote's always stuck with me. The brain is for having ideas, not for holding ideas. That for me has always summed it up really nicely. You mentioned, as you were kind of introducing yourself, that for a lot of people, their kind of first introduction to notes is as a way of kind of capturing information from lectures and classes. And I'm sure there's a lot of listeners for whom note making, when they're sitting there in a lecture or a class, particularly at kind of university or college level rather than sort of school, high school level, that's kind of a big part of their day-to-day academic reality. So I just wondered, kind of based on, your work and your expertise in good note-making practice, what might be kind of some of your like top tips or kind of practical recommendations for that kind of style of note-making? You're sat in a lecture, you've got someone at the front with the PowerPoint and talking, and you've either got a blank sheet of paper or a laptop. I know your kind of current book is mainly focused on digital note-making. Yeah, what are some of your suggestions for doing note-making well in a live class or lecture?
That's a great, very practical prompt. I love it. So the first thing I'll say is that one of the things that is implied by this question is that what we call notes is actually a bunch of different things that have different purposes, right? So note is one of these words that we use very casually to refer to actually very different things. There's a kind of note that you take when you're going to go to the grocery store to buy stuff, right? And you don't want to find yourself, like I often do, in the middle of the aisles thinking, why am I here? So, you write down a little list. That's the scenario where notes are serving as a kind of prosthetic memory, right? You're writing it down in the moment so that when you need it, it will be there. That's one use case for notes. Another use case is what we were talking about earlier, planning for a project, right? Or outlining a presentation or what have you. That's a more generative use case. And then we come to the use case that you're asking about here, which is how do you capture the essence of something that is being told to you, a lecture. And that is a different modality from writing the grocery list or planning out a project. I think that's obvious when we talk about it like that, but it's worth acknowledging that we use the same word to describe them all, right? So it's the first thing I would say is be mindful of why you're taking notes. Is the purpose to somehow recall something verbatim, Well, that's going to be a different use case than if you're trying to learn the gist of something or trying to internalize or synthesize a set of models, right? One idea that keeps coming up for me, you talked about the book being focused on digital note taking, and that's true. But I take a lot of notes by hand. In fact, I'm writing down what we're talking about here. There are some points that are coming up that I'm writing down by hand.
So am I.
There you go. And I have found that when taking lecture notes, it is helpful for me to do it with a pen, pencil, or stylus as opposed to a keyboard. And there is a little bit of research that backs this up. The idea being that we somehow internalize the things we hear more effectively if we are writing things down by hand. And the hypothesis there, I don't think that this has been proven, but the hypothesis is that many people write by hand, write long form more slowly than they type. And as a result, we are less prone to try to capture things verbatim. So that's one thing that you might want to consider is try capturing lecture ideas in lectures by writing them by hand as opposed to typing. If, as this hypothesis suggests, you're slower in writing by hand than you are in typing, that might actually be a good thing because that in some ways forces you, I was going to say forces your hand, but terrible pun, right? It kind of forces you to listen differently, right? Like you're not listening for verbatim phrases that you want to quote. You're listening for the big ideas. And that brings me to another tip that I would give to folks who are trying to make sense of what they're hearing is oftentimes a presenter, whether it's in a classroom context or in a conference or something like that, oftentimes the presenter will, toward the beginning of the presentation, they will give you an outline of what they're going to be talking about. And I find that when I'm in that situation, trying to make sense of what I'm hearing in a lecture, if the presenter gives me an outline, I immediately try to write down the main points. And I start thinking about that as a structure around which I will flesh out my notes. So it's very helpful. I find it very helpful when presenters do that. And it happens quite often, right? In teaching contexts or, like I said, in conferences. So that's another thing to be on the lookout for. The third thing I will say is one primary distinction that you want to be aware of is whether you are listening to a lecture that is happening live, as in the presenter is in the room with you, or the presentation is being streamed live over the internet, or whether you're listening to a recording. Obviously, if you're listening to a recording, you can pause and rewind, right? Which is a capability that is not available in live scenarios, and one that you can take advantage of. So I find that when I'm taking notes of lectures that are recorded, I'm a little more relaxed because I know that I can circle back. So that's an important idea, is the degree to which you are feeling relaxed in doing this, or you're kind of on edge, right? I find that the more that I try to capture things verbatim, or the more kind of serious the situation is, the more stressed I am, and the worse it's not the worst notes, the worse my listening gets, right? Like this is about listening in some way. And if you can be relaxed in the situation, you can listen better. And if you can listen better, you'll take better notes. So I think those were 3 points. But those are some points that I find helpful when taking notes of lectures.
So potentially consider writing it with pen, because that might encourage you to, because you can't write so quickly, you have to synthesize and sort of put it in your own words. And that Daniel Willingham talks about, the memory is the residue of thought. So if you're kind of thinking a bit more deeply about it rather than just kind of surface level scribbling it down verbatim, that's likely to help start the learning process at least. The second point being about writing down the outline. That's a great idea. And, for educators, presenters listening, make sure we give those outlines at the start, I guess would be a tip for the other side there. And then finally, thinking about live versus on demand and kind of pause potential and using that accordingly. Great. We touched on a kind of another style of where notes might come into play in an academic context as well, a little earlier, which is, more this kind of idea that, maybe it sort of sits somewhere between what we're talking about now and kind of pure generative note making. So the scenario where you're working on a piece of academic writing, maybe a kind of a weekly essay that you have to do as part of your university course, or maybe it's a kind of a larger, more substantial sort of dissertation type project that you might be working on over many weeks or months. I just wondered if you had any, in a similar vein, any kind of particular kind of practical suggestions for that style of note making, where you're kind of trying to work through kind of large amounts of research and reading, distill down your ideas, your arguments, structure a finished product, a bit like the challenge of kind of structuring a book, which I know you talk about in the book. Yeah, kind of any suggestions for us for that style of note making work?
Yeah, and I would say I think that is much of the advice in the book kind of leans in that direction, right?
Yeah.
And I think that in many ways, this is the trickier kind of note. I use this distinction in the book, which comes from Dr. Fiona McPherson. And I'll make a parenthesis here to plug her book. I think it's called Effective Note Taking, which is it's specifically targeted at students, right? And in that book, Dr. McPherson makes a distinction between note taking and note making, where the way that I understand that note taking is more of I'm listening to a lecture and trying to take down what I'm hearing, versus note making, which is more generative. The first thing I will say about note making, this more generative style of thinking with things, is that you need to be conscious or at least aware of why you're doing it. So in my case, I like to read a lot. I like to learn independently. And oftentimes I'll be reading a book and an idea will stand out to me, right? And I will highlight it. I usually read ebooks. I will highlight it in the book and maybe make a little marginal note using the Kindle app. And that's an idea that will go into my knowledge repository, right? My note-taking system. And that happens fairly frequently. But I think about things differently if I'm reading a book and I come across an idea that is going to be relevant to a project that I'm working on. For example, when I was writing, duly noted, I was doing a lot of reading about the subject of personal information management, note taking, how people learn, all of these things. And I would come across lots of ideas, models, stories, right? And there's this effect. I know there's a name for it. It escapes me right now. But there's this effect that happens when somebody, let's say that you're thinking of buying a car, right? And you've been researching a particular make and model, and all of a sudden you start seeing it everywhere. It's like you walk out on the street and it's like, oh, there's one of them. And it's this notion that we become primed to be on the lookout for things that are within our awareness or attention. And the same thing happens with ideas. If I am writing a book about note taking, all of a sudden, ideas about note taking are going to take a special, they're going to stand out to me in a different way. And what I do is I use tags to help me associate that idea with the project. So while I was writing duly noted, I started a tag, hashtag duly noted. And if I read something in an ebook, I would make a little, I would highlight it and I would make a little note. Sometimes all the note had was hashtag duly noted, right? Because afterward, I wanted to be able to import that into my note-taking system. And because I had tagged it, it achieves a little bit of that David Allen thing, right? Like I all of a sudden I've made it so that it becomes part of this corpus of ideas that is going to be part of this project. So that's one thing that I would suggest thinking about. Well, being aware of why you are doing the thing that you're doing. And if you're doing it for a particular project in mind, then consider making that project a thing by which I mean, starting a tag or maybe keeping a folder in your computer where you save things related to that. Just the mere fact of doing that helps you pay attention differently to the thing that you are working on. The other thing I will say here is that just as there are different use cases for notes, there are different media for note taking. And the media that are appropriate to remembering things later might not be the most appropriate for the kind of note taking that we are talking about now. The way that many of us take notes is on paper notebooks with a pen. I do that myself. And writing things down on paper is beneficial. It's certainly better than not doing it at all. Paper has many wonderful advantages, but paper also has certain constraints. And one of the constraints it has is that the ideas that you write down in a notebook get captured in kind of chronological order, in the order that you came across them. That is not the only order in which you might want to organize your ideas. So if you are capturing ideas or writing down ideas for generative purposes and for long-term learning as well, it behooves you to look into digital note-taking systems. This is one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because we have amazing capabilities with computers. Alas, some of the most popular note-taking apps with computers are designed to suggest metaphors that come from the paper world. So if you look at an application like OneNote, that application is structured into notebooks which have sections, which have pages, and it's a fairly rigid hierarchical structure. If you look at Apple Notes, which is another popular note-taking app, it has folders, and within folders you have individual notes. And while these apps let you do things like create links to web pages and to other notes, they're not really designed for this. So there are other tools out there that are more conducive to a more fluid way of thinking that I find is incredibly powerful and worth exploring. So that's another thing that I would encourage folks to do, to really look at the tools that you're using for this, because they will allow you to think in different ways. I'll stop there and see if you have any response.
No, that's great. That's really interesting. And I was going to ask you about sort of the pros and cons of digital versus paper note making. We're sort of touching on that. Maybe there's a place for both. Paper might be quite good when you're sitting there in that lecture capturing things in the first place. But when it comes to, perhaps this more kind of project-based work, or just kind of capturing your day-to-day flashes of inspiration and having somewhere to kind of organize it, tag it, structure it, the flexibility, the interlinkability, the searchability of digital, has some pretty strong things to say in favor of it. I know the system that you favor is called Obsidian, right? So maybe just tell us a little bit about sort of why you like that, or, if you want to choose a different one, then maybe these are some of the things you might be looking out for when you're choosing a good note-making app.
Definitely. The first thing I'll say about that is that even though we've had note-taking apps for a long time, like I said, many of the most popular ones implement user interface metaphors that come from the paper world. And that's obviously not the only way to organize things with computers. Digital does not have the constraints of the physical world. So you can implement lots of different ways of structuring information. There has been a lot of experimentation starting in the 1960s, really, around what is called hypertexts. The idea that rather than have a fixed order, whether it's chronological or hierarchical or what have you, ideas can be linked to each other in more fluid ways. Think Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is a very large website where kind of the richness of it comes from links that happen somewhat not arbitrarily, but certainly not as hierarchically as in a more regular website, right? So these sorts of systems have been around for a long time, but they haven't been very mainstream. And what's happened over the last 3 to 4 years is that there are new applications that have become widely available that implement a lot of these other ways of structuring information in very accessible ways. Obsidian is one of them. I picked it for a variety. I picked it to discuss in the book for a variety of reasons. One reason, I think the kind of most selfish one, is that it's the one that I use, but I use it for many of the same reasons why I think readers might benefit from it. But I'll say right off the bat that you don't have to use Obsidian to do all this stuff. There are other applications that let you do this. Obsidian just happens to be fairly convenient as an illustration because A, it's free for personal use. B, it saves your notes in the most open format imaginable as plain text files on your computer. That is not something to be underestimated, because if you decide to discontinue use of the software, you still have your data in a format that you can open with any other application pretty much built in the last 40 or 50 years. I mean, it literally is that open. Another reason is that Obsidian it's built on a model, or it's designed on a model of plugins that extend its functionality. And there is a fairly vibrant community of third-party individuals, mostly, who are creating new plugins that extend the application's functionality in very, very interesting ways. For example, there are plugins that allow you to use large language models with your notes, so that you can do things like find relations or possible relations between a note and another note in the system, or select a region of text and have it run through OpenAI's GPT-4 model, right? And then it writes the result of that prompt in the body of the note. And just like that, there are many other extensions to this tool. So it's a fairly easy system to get into because of its low cost. It is also a fairly easy system to get out of if you need to do that, right? And that's not true of all of these note-taking systems. And I think it's pretty important that you be able to do that, because you're going to be doing this hopefully for a long time. If you're serious about learning, the repository of notes serves as a long-term place for you to do your thinking. So it's important for it to be fairly open in both inputting data and letting you take it out.
That's a great recommendation. So many interesting things. I wonder, as we're kind of perhaps heading towards some kind of conclusion today, if you have maybe 2 or 3 little sort of favorite little note-making hacks, if you like, that we haven't talked about so far. So some things that are quick to articulate, quick to implement, and have that kind of nice dopamine buzz of allowing you to kind of automate or do something more quickly and flexibly and more easily than was possible before applying the idea. I wonder if anything comes to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. One that immediately comes to mind is that, before I tell you what the tip is, I'll tell you the kind of reasoning behind this. Oftentimes when you're making a note, you're doing it to augment your memory, or you're thinking about something, and it's going to be something that is fairly near term. You do whatever you need to do, and then you don't think about that note again, right? So the grocery list is an example of that. Once you come back from the grocery store, you crumple up the piece of paper and toss it in the bin. You don't really need it anymore. That's one kind of note. But there are some things that you want to be able to come back to over time, sometimes after a long time, right? So in the course of writing Duly Noted, I came across a note that I had written down while reading a book a decade earlier. And that's an example of coming back to an idea after a long time and doing something with it, making some use of it. If you are going to be learning anything, and if you are committed to living a life of the mind, or a life where you're going to be learning continually, and I hope that a lot of the people listening in, the audience of your show, I expect there's going to be people who are in that camp. It behooves you to write things down in a way that future you will be able to make sense of. By future you, I mean literally yourself, maybe 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, you're going to have different concerns, different understandings. You're going to be in a different context when you come back to this. So you have to think about, when you're writing something down, what is the minimum amount of context that you can bake into this idea so that future you will not be completely lost? And in my case, there are two things that I write pretty much in anything that I write down. One is I write a title, a little title, right? And again, it might be related to a project. It might be the name of a thing that I'm making, but I make sure that it has a title. For example, the notes for this conversation that you and I are having is titled After Duly Noted, because this conversation is part of a series of conversations that I'm having around the book, right? So, and I have my own kind of shorthand for meetings about this subject. So that's one thing that I write pretty much on everything that I capture. The other thing is the date. Yes, computers do this automatically. They timestamp whatever you've created. But I have found that writing it down, like explicitly saying, this is the date when I captured this, has made it possible for me to associate the ideas captured in the note with whatever I'm working on at the time. It has made it more findable. It has made it possible for me to kind of come back to context a lot more quickly. And I've settled on a particular format for writing dates. So that's the other important thing here. I don't write out in English, April 25th, 2024, right? What I do is I write in a particular format, which is based on an ISO standard. So the format is the year. So in this case, 2024, then a dash, then the month number with two places, right? So in this case, it would be 04, which is April. We're recording this on April 25th, right? So 2024-04, and then dash and the date itself, again, 2 digits. So in this case, -25. So 2024-04-25. And I realize that this sounds super fiddly, but there are reasons why I capture it like this. I've written a whole blog post about it. One of the primary reasons is that I work a lot with computers. And when written in this format, computers have an easier time of sorting things by date, because they sort the year, then the month, then the date. And there's a certain consistency. And I do this even when I'm writing things by hand. So I've kind of trained myself to think a little mechanically about this, just for the sake of consistency. So again, the point there is, you don't have to do it like I do, but the point is, think about future you and think about what you can add to notes, the minimum amount of things that you can add to the note to give it context, so that when you sit in front of this thing 6 months from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, like in my case, you have enough context to come back to it and make sense of what's written there.
Tangent note, public service announcement, date formats. We've all got together. We've had the International Standards Organization meeting. It has been decided this is the format. Please get on board. I think that's a really nice piece of advice. And while you were talking just there, I was thinking, maybe if it was me and I was thinking about how I might apply this, I was just wondering, maybe I might kind of add a third field of location, because I often find that when I have my most kind of interesting ideas or brainstorms, like, it's quite often in a specific location, it's somewhere different. And part of the reason I'm having some insight is because I've had a bit more brain space than normal. If nothing else, it's just sort of a little bit fun, I think, to sort of associate, I was in that cafe, or I was on that, trip, or whatever it was. And then I look back and I have a sort of slightly more rounded memory. There's a lot of research on kind of context dependent memory. And, if you're thinking about that kind of place you were when you learned something, it sort of helps facilitate that recall. So yeah, no, I think that's a really nice piece of advice, and I will definitely start to do that. Fantastic. So look, George, this has been such an interesting conversation. It's been so fun to think about kind of notes at this level of expertise. I really enjoyed sort of picking this apart, and it's been really really fun to explore. So thank you. I always ask guests, what sort of, if there's any advice you wish you'd known as a younger student yourself, and I remember you talking about your own excitement about the start of term, and opening that fresh notebook at the start of the school year, and the prospects of things to come. So, thinking about that old version of you, some of the lessons you've learned through your experience since, what do you kind of feel might have been helpful for you to know that much sooner in your journey?
I think that the thing that would have helped me the most was to understand this distinction between the kind of notes that we take just for now, the shopping list that gets crumpled into the bin when you get home, versus things that will serve you for a long time. I mentioned earlier in the call that when I was young, I would take notes in class, and I would end the semester with these binders full of notes, which once the final exam was over, I would summarily get rid of, right? And there was so much stuff in there, and it's all gone. It's all gone. If I had this model in mind that, there are some things that you're writing down here that you're going to want to come back to because they're going to come up in other contexts. If I had understood that when I was younger, I would have captured things differently. I would have paid attention differently. Maybe I would have used a different medium, right? I would have maybe used index cards rather than binders. So that idea that some notes you can toss out safely, but some you want to keep is something that I wish I had known when I was younger. So if there's one thing that I would tell my younger self is, hey, some of these things are going to matter in the long term. So be more thoughtful about what you do with this stuff.
I guess that's another argument for having it digital. You don't have to have garages full of your paper notes through your academic career. You can keep it all stored digitally. I remember having I was the opposite. I kept all of my notes throughout much of my academic career, and it took up boxes and boxes of space in my bedroom / parents' attic. And when I moved out, I had a lot of clearing out to do.
Yeah, and it's not only the bulk; it's also the fact that they're not easily accessible. Right? You can't Command F or Control F to find stuff in there. You have to have a really careful indexing system to find anything. So yes, absolutely. Computers help.
Well, on which note? So if we're wanting to get deeper into using computers to help us with our note making, sort of inspired by our chat today, tell us a little bit more about where we can find you and your work and learn more about this topic.
The best place to follow up with me and my work is on my personal website, which is jarango.com. So that's jarango.com. The book is called Duly Noted, and it has a website too. The URL for that is dulynoted.fyi. So you can learn more about the book there. I look forward to hearing from folks. Do reach out if this is something that is interesting and important to you.
Wonderful. I appreciate that. And thank you once again for coming on the show and sharing some of your top tips. It's been really great to talk. Thanks once again, and all best wishes.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, William.
Well, thank you, George. And I've put a link to George's book, Duly Noted, in the episode description today. And remember, whenever you treat yourself to a book via a link in one of our episode descriptions, Exam Study Expert earns a small commission at no extra cost to you. So it's a nice little way to support the show if you're enjoying what we do for you. Next week, we'll be looking at the academic research process and how you can use AI to streamline it. If you know what Google Scholar is and spend any time using it, then you really need to listen to next week's episode. If you don't know what Google Scholar is, but you might have an undergraduate or especially postgraduate degree at some point in your future, then you might really be interested in having a listen to next week's episode anyway, to give you a flavour of what might be ahead for you. And beyond the world of research, I've also included mention of a few other AI tools that can help with other aspects of the academic process. So how to write well and even how to transcribe lectures and classes. So some interesting tools to help streamline various aspects of your academic world coming up next week. And then in 2 weeks' time, we'll be wrapping up this little series on kind of academic skills with a lesson from me on how to plan your written work of any kind, whether that's a long answer question in an exam or an essay, coursework, dissertations, even a whole thesis or a whole book. I'll look forward to seeing you over the next couple of weeks for those conversations. For now, I just want to wish you every success, as always, in your studies.
Well, that was good, wasn't it? I found myself taking notes. If you need a reminder of anything from today, head to the website for a write-up of this episode, as well as lots more top-notch advice and resources. That's examstudyexpert.com. See you next time.